The iron skillet hit the floor before Clara could move. She was already halfway across the kitchen when Dorlan's hand caught her by the wrist and spun her back around. The soup she'd been stirring was still on the stove. She could hear it bubbling. She could smell the onions. And the only thing going through her mind in that half-second before the second blow landed was that she hadn't salted it yet, and Dorlan would be furious about that too. Clara Marsh hit the wall with her shoulder and stayed there a moment, one hand pressed flat against the rough plaster, her vision doing that white and swimming thing it did now. The thing she'd stopped mentioning because mentioning it only made him angrier. Outside, the wind was coming down off the mesa, the way it always did in late October, cold and deliberate, rattling the loose shutter on the south side of the house that Dorlan had promised to fix since March, and hadn't. She straightened up slowly. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying made it last longer. Dorlan was already sitting back down at the table. He pulled his plate toward him, and picked up his fork, and looked at her the way a man looks at a dog that has tracked mud across a clean floor. Not with rage. That would come later, maybe, or maybe not. This was something quieter and more permanent than rage. This was the look that said she was less than what he'd expected, and he expected very little. "Soup's burning," he said. Clara went back to the stove. She had been 19 when she married Dorlan Marsh. She was 24 now, which meant 5 years, which meant she had stopped counting the individual incidents and started counting the years instead, the way a prisoner counts, not the hours, but the sentences. Dorlan was 41. He had a cattle operation outside Redrock, New Mexico, which was to say, he had 40 acres of hard ground and 12 head of cattle, and a reputation for being difficult to deal with, and a mouthful of excuses for why the difficult-to-deal-with part was always someone else's fault. He was not a stupid man. That was the part people on the outside never quite understood. Stupid men were easier. Stupid men made obvious mistakes, left obvious evidence, gave you something obvious to point to. Dorlan was careful. He was careful about where he hit her, and careful about what he said in town, and careful about the face he wore at church on the Sundays he went, which were the Sundays he felt the neighbors might be watching. He shook hands firmly. He paid his tab. He tipped his hat to women he passed on the boardwalk. He was, by every visible measure, a solid man. Clara had stopped trying to explain this to anyone after the second year. What she had, instead of explanations, was a plan. She had been building it in pieces for 11 months, the way you build a fire with wet wood, slowly, quietly, tending it when no one was looking, making sure it didn't go out. The first piece was the money. She had started with change, pennies from the bottom of his coat pockets when she was doing his washing, a nickel she found under the bread box, dimes from the tin he kept on the windowsill that he never quite kept track of. She kept it in a flour sack she'd sewn shut and pushed behind the loose brick at the back of the root cellar, the brick that had been loose since before they moved in, and that Dorlan had never once gone near because Dorlan did not do root cellars. By October, she had $63.40, mostly in small coins with a few paper bills she'd traded the coins for at the general store, in increments small enough not to be noticed. The second piece was the letter. She had written it in March, sitting at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning when Dorlan was sleeping off a bad night, written it by candlelight in her smallest handwriting on a piece of paper she'd torn from the back of the household ledger. She had addressed it to the Women's Aid office in Santa Fe that she'd read about in a 2-year-old newspaper she'd found wrapping dried beans at the store. She had mailed it from the postal window in Redrock on a Tuesday when Dorlan had driven out to the far pasture, telling the postmaster it was a letter to her aunt. The reply had come 6 weeks later, addressed to Clara Finch, which was her maiden name and the name she'd used in the letter, and it had come tucked inside a seed catalog addressed to a Martha Finch, which was a name she'd invented. The letter said there was a woman in Santa Fe named Mrs. Eleanor Voss who helped women in difficult situations find legal counsel and safe accommodation, and that if Clara was able to get herself to Santa Fe, there would be someone to meet her at the stage depot. She had read that letter standing in the yard next to the mailbox, and then she had walked back to the house and put it under the loose brick with the money. The third piece was time. She needed Dorlan away from the property for long enough that she could get to the stage in Redrock, which was 11 miles, which meant borrowing a horse from somewhere, or walking the whole distance in darkness, neither of which was simple. Dorlan's horse was in the barn. Her horse, the mare she'd had since she was 17, the one she'd brought into the marriage Dorlan had sold 2 winters ago to cover a debt he wouldn't discuss. She had been waiting for the right window ever since. It came on a Thursday in early November. Dorlan told her at breakfast that he was riding to Castleton to look at a bull a man named Pickett was selling, that he'd be gone overnight and back by Friday evening, and that she should have the house in order and supper ready when he returned. He said this the way he said most things to her, not looking up from his plate, not expecting a response. The information delivered the way a man posts a notice on a fence post, not as a communication, but as an instruction left for someone who would have no option but to comply. Clara said yes, and cleared his plate, and watched him ride out. She stood at the kitchen window until he was past the ridge and out of sight. Then she stood there, another 10 minutes to be sure. Then she went to the root cellar. She left at dusk. She took the $63, and the letter, and a change of clothes wrapped in a flour sack, and the photograph of her parents that she kept in the back of the Bible. She took the small folding knife her father had given her when she turned 16, the one with the carved bone handle. She took nothing else. 5 years of her life, and she carried out of it what she could hold in one hand. The road to Redrock was not a road so much as a track in the dirt made permanent by enough wagons going the same direction. It ran through open scrubland for most of the first 4 miles before it hit the canyon section where the rock walls came up close on both sides and the footing got uncertain in the dark. She had a lantern, a small one, and she kept the wick turned low enough that the light barely reached her feet. She walked fast. The wind was up, and the temperature had dropped the way it dropped in the high desert in November, fast and without apology, and by the time she cleared the canyon section, she couldn't feel her fingertips, and her left shoulder was aching where the wall had caught it. She was 3 miles from Redrock when she heard the horse. She stopped. She turned the lantern down all the way and stood still in the dark, listening. Hooves on the hard track behind her, coming at a walk, not running. She stepped off the road into the brush and crouched down and waited with the lantern against her chest and the knife in her other hand, which was shaking from cold or from fear, and she couldn't tell which. The rider came around the bend at a slow walk. The horse was a roan and the rider was a man she didn't recognize, which meant he wasn't from Redrock. He was lean, maybe 35, with a hat pulled low and a canvas duster, and he was riding with his hands easy on the reins, not looking for anything in particular as far as she could tell. He would have passed her completely if the roan hadn't stopped and turned its head toward the brush where she was crouching. The man looked at the horse. Then he looked toward the brush. "I'm not going to trouble you," he said to the dark. Clara didn't answer. "Saw your light a mile back?" he said. "Roads in this canyon at night aren't friendly for a person on foot. I'll keep riding if you want." "That's fine." She looked at the roan. The roan looked at her. She stood up. She did not put the knife away. The man looked at her for a moment, taking in the flour sack and the lantern and the knife, with an expression that wasn't readable in the dark, and then he looked at her shoulder, the left one, where she knew the bruising from this week had crept up to the edge of her collar. He didn't say anything about that. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Redrock. I'm going that direction. I can give you a ride as far as the stage depot." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "My name's Holt. I'm a ranch manager out of Mora County, coming through on my way to Silver City." He said it plainly, without the over-eager quality men sometimes used when they wanted you to know they weren't dangerous, the quality that always made her more nervous rather than less. He just said it, the facts, offered without performance. She put the knife in her coat pocket. "I'll walk," she said. "But you can ride alongside if you want." He nodded once and turned the roan to face the direction she was going. And they went toward Redrock like that, her on foot and him on horseback at a walking pace, not talking much, the wind coming down off the mesa and the stars very bright, the way they got when there was no moon. She bought her stage ticket at 6 in the morning. Standing at the window of the depot with her hair down from the wind and her boots muddy, and the woman behind the counter looking at her with the careful blankness of someone who had seen women in this particular condition before, understood that the kindest thing was to simply process the transaction. Holt had ridden off before she reached the depot. He'd stopped his horse at the edge of the main street and looked at her, and she'd looked at him, and he'd said, "Stage to Santa Fe runs at 7. You've got time." Then he'd tipped his hat and turned the roan and gone. She sat on the wooden bench outside the depot and ate the biscuit she'd packed that morning and watched the street come awake. The blacksmith's at the far end was already lit. A boy was sweeping the boardwalk outside the hardware store. A woman in a yellow dress was carrying a basket somewhere with the brisk purpose of a person who had things to do. Clara watched the woman in the yellow dress until she turned a corner and disappeared. She thought about Dorlan coming home on Friday evening to an empty house. She thought about the expression on his face when he found the root cellar brick. She thought about what he would do next, which would be to go to her sister's house in Albuquerque, because her sister's house was the only place he'd imagined she'd gone. She did not have a sister. She had invented a sister in a story she'd told him early in the marriage, a story she'd been careful to maintain just enough that it lived in his mind as a real thing. Her actual family was in Missouri. He didn't know that because she had never told him, because she had understood even in the first year that there were pieces of herself worth protecting from him. The biscuit was good. She had made it herself that morning, before she left, in the dark kitchen with the fire still low. It seemed important to have made it. She didn't examine that too closely. Dorlan came back from Castleton on Friday afternoon instead of Friday evening. The bull hadn't suited him. Pickett wanted too much, and Dorlan didn't like the look in the animal's eye, which was a thing he said about bulls and people with equal frequency and equal certainty. He rode home in a bad mood that had been getting worse since Castleton, and arrived at his property to find the kitchen cold and the fire out, and his wife not in the house. He checked the barn. He checked the yard. He stood on the porch and called her name once, with the particular flatness of a man who is not really expecting an answer. Then he went to the root cellar. He stood there for a long time looking at the loose brick and the empty space behind it. He was in Redrock by nightfall, asking questions at the depot. The woman behind the window told him she didn't recall anyone matching that description, which was a lie of the most deliberate kind, the kind that costs something to tell, and she told it without flinching. Dorlan leaned on the counter a while and asked again with his voice at a different register, the register Clara would have recognized, and the woman behind the window met his eyes and said she was sorry. She couldn't help him. He went to the saloon. He had 2 whiskeys and talked to a man who knew a man who said he thought he'd seen a woman with a flour sack walking the Redrock Road Thursday night. Dorlan had a 3rd whiskey and thought about it. He left for Santa Fe at first light on Saturday. Clara was in Santa Fe by then. She had been met at the stage depot by a young woman named Iris, who had warm eyes and a practical gray coat, and who took Clara's flour sack without comment and led her to a narrow townhouse on a side street where Mrs. Eleanor Voss was drinking coffee at a kitchen table that had papers on it and a lamp going despite the morning light. Mrs. Voss was perhaps 60, with white hair and the kind of face that had been good-looking once and was now something better certain. She looked at Clara the way a doctor looks at a patient, direct and unsentimental and without any horror in it, which was what Clara had needed without knowing she'd needed it. "Sit down," she said. "There's coffee. Tell me what you're working with." Clara sat down. She told her about the $63 and the letter and the 5 years and Dorlan's habits and Dorlan's property and the fact that they had no children, which was a grief and also, in this moment, something that simplified things. Mrs. Voss listened without interrupting. Then she set down her coffee cup and said, "I have a lawyer named Thomas Garrett who takes these cases. He's in this building on Mondays. Today is Saturday. You have 2 days. You'll stay here. He may come looking," Clara said. "Men like this do," Mrs. Voss said, without any change in her expression. "We have dealt with men like this before." Dorlan arrived in Santa Fe on Sunday morning. He was not a man who gave up easily. This was one of the things Clara had always known about him. One of the things she had built her 11 months of planning around the certainty that when he found out, he would come, and that she needed to be somewhere defensible when he arrived. He went first to the stage depot and showed her description around, and a man there directed him, not maliciously but carelessly, to the general area of the city where the Women's Aid Office was known to operate. Santa Fe was not a large city. Dorlan was methodical. By afternoon he was on the right street. Mrs. Voss saw him from the upstairs window. She came downstairs at a pace that was brisk and entirely without panic. She said to Clara, who was at the kitchen table reading a month-old newspaper, "Your husband is on the street. Stay in this room. There is a lock on the door. Use it." Then she straightened her coat and went out the front door and stood on the step. Dorlan came up the walk. He looked at Mrs. Voss the way he had looked at the woman at the depot window in Redrock, the measuring look. The look that was deciding whether politeness would be sufficient or whether he would need to use something else. I'm looking for my wife, he said. A great many men say that, Mrs. Voss said. It rarely means what they think it means. Clara Marsh, 24, dark hair, came in on the Thursday or Friday stage. I don't discuss the women in my care. Dorlan's face shifted. She is my wife, and I have the legal right. You are welcome to speak to a lawyer about what rights you have, Mrs. Voss said. I would encourage it. I think you may find the conversation educational. Dorlan took a step closer. He was a large man. He had used his size as a kind of argument his whole life, the physical weight of himself as punctuation at the end of sentences. Mrs. Voss did not move. Ma'am? Said a voice from the street. Both of them looked. Thomas Garrett was, in the ordinary sense, an unremarkable-looking man, medium height, early 40s, with a dark suit and a leather satchel and the kind of face that gave very little away. He had come around the corner at the right moment because Mrs. Voss had sent Iris for him an hour ago when she first saw Dorlan from the window. He came up the walk and stopped next to Mrs. Voss and looked at Dorlan with no particular expression. Thomas Garrett, he said, attorney at law. You're on private property. This isn't your business, Dorlan said. Mrs. Voss is my client, Garrett said, which makes her property my business, and the people on it my business, and how they're spoken to very much my business. He set his satchel down on the step beside him, with the calm deliberateness of a man who had done this before and did not find it alarming. The woman you're looking for has retained my services as of this morning. She has filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office documenting 5 years of physical abuse. I have an appointment with Judge Holloway on Monday morning. Dorlan looked at him. His jaw was tight. She has no proof. She has a medical examination conducted this morning by Dr. Annette Larkins, Garrett said. She has documentation of injuries consistent with ongoing abuse spanning several years. She has $63 she saved in secret over 11 months because she was afraid to ask you for money directly, which is itself a kind of testimony. He paused. And she has me. The street was quiet. A dog somewhere was barking at something. Down the block, 2 men were talking outside a feed store, not paying attention. Dorlan stood very still for a moment. Clara knew that stillness. She was watching through the upstairs window with her hand flat against the glass, and she knew that stillness, the way she knew the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way she knew which silence meant the worst was over, and which silence meant it hadn't started yet. This silence lasted a long time. Then Dorlan picked up his hat from where he'd pushed it back on his head, resettled it, and looked at Garrett with a flat expression that had something mean and calculating in it. This isn't finished, he said. No, Garrett said. It goes to the judge on Monday. I'll see you there. Dorlan walked back down the path. He didn't look up at the window. Clara had not expected him to. He got on his horse and rode down the street and around the corner and was gone. Mrs. Voss came back inside. She came upstairs and unlocked the door and found Clara standing at the window. He'll come back, Clara said. Possibly, Mrs. Voss said, but not to this house. He'll come back in a courtroom, with a lawyer of his own if he has sense. And in a courtroom, Thomas Garrett is better than anything Dorlan Marsh can afford. She looked at Clara carefully. How are you? Clara thought about that. The honest answer was that she was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The honest answer was that part of her was still in that kitchen in Redrock, listening to the soup bubble and thinking about salt. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet what was on the other side of all this, couldn't see the shape of it, and the not seeing was its own kind of vertigo. But she was standing at a window in Santa Fe, and Dorlan was riding away, and she had $63, and a lawyer, and a photograph of her parents, and a woman named Mrs. Voss who had not flinched. I'm all right, she said. The hearing before Judge Holloway was on Monday. Dorlan had not found a lawyer, or had found one and been told something he didn't like, or had simply not believed it would come to this, or some combination of all three. He came to the courthouse alone, which was the first mistake, and he came with the expression of a man who expected to be agreed with, which was the second mistake. And when the documentation was presented, Dr. Larkins's report, the letter from Redrock, the testimony Clara gave in a clear and level voice that did not waver once he had nothing. He said she was a troubled woman. He said she'd always been difficult. He said the injuries were exaggerated, and the money she claimed to have saved was money she had stolen from him, and he'd like it back. Judge Holloway looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I've been on this bench for 18 years. I've heard every version of this particular story. The telling doesn't improve with repetition." The separation was granted. Garrett had told her before the hearing not to expect more than that right away, that the law in 1893 moved slowly and imperfectly on matters like this, that what they were building was a foundation. She understood that. She had spent 5 years learning to be patient about things she couldn't control, and now she was redirecting that patience toward things she could. Dorlan walked out of the courthouse without looking at her. She watched him go. She did the arithmetic of what came next. She had $63, which was not enough for long, but was enough for now. She had a room at Mrs. Voss's house for another 2 weeks, at which point she would need to make other arrangements. Mrs. Voss had mentioned a woman in town who ran a millinery shop and was looking for reliable help. Clara had made every piece of clothing she'd worn for the past 5 years. She thought she could probably manage a millinery shop. Iris was waiting for her on the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" Iris asked. Clara looked out at the Santa Fe street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning commerce of it, men and horses and the smell of bread from somewhere, and the sky very blue the way it got in November at this altitude. She thought about the kitchen in Redrock. She thought about the sound of the iron skillet on the floor. She thought about the 4 o'clock mornings, and the root cellar, and the seed catalog, with the letter inside. She thought about Holt on the roan horse saying stage to Santa Fe runs at 7 and riding away without waiting for thanks. She thought about what her mother had told her once, when she was maybe 11 years old, standing in their kitchen in Missouri. That the thing about hard times is they feel permanent, and the fact that they feel permanent is a lie. And learning to know it's a lie is a skill, and you can practice it the way you practice anything. "I feel like I have a lot of things left to figure out," Clara said. Iris nodded. "That's about right." They walked back toward the townhouse together, into the morning, into whatever it was that came next. Clara didn't escape because someone rescued her. She escaped because for 11 months, in the dark and in silence, she kept building one penny at a time, one careful letter, one invented sister, one loose brick in a cellar. Freedom rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often, it is assembled quietly, in pieces, by someone who refuses to stop believing it is possible, even when everything around them says otherwise. That belief is worth protecting. A note to our listeners: this story was crafted and imagined by AI, created to entertain you and, along the way, leave something worth carrying with you.